Inside the silence of a forgotten countryside, there stands a house that time has not touched in decades. From the outside, it looks like just another crumbling relic of the past, its windows dulled with dust, its paint chipped away by years of weather, its garden overtaken by weeds. To anyone passing by, it seems no different from other abandoned homes scattered across lonely backroads. Yet, the moment you step through its doorway, something unsettles you in a way that words can hardly describe. It is not simply empty. It is frozen. Every detail inside suggests that life did not leave gradually, it stopped, suddenly, violently, as though the house itself had swallowed the family whole and refused to release them. On the long wooden dining table, porcelain plates are still laid out as though a family had gathered for supper just moments before. Forks remain resting on the rims of plates. A glass of water is half full. The chairs are pulled slightly back, as if their occupants rose in a hurry. Even the remains of food, though rotted and unrecognizable now, still cling to the china like the shadow of a meal never finished. The strangest part is not the dust, or the decay, or the stillness. It is the absence of closure. There are no packed bags in the hallway, no signs of preparation, no explanation as to why an entire family would leave everything behind. The kitchen counters remain cluttered with utensils, pots and pans left where they last cooled. A loaf of bread sits hardened into stone inside a bread box. On the mantelpiece in the living room, family photographs still stand, showing smiling faces in faded colors. The toys of children are scattered in corners, as if they were abandoned mid-play. Every object in this house whispers the same question: what could have driven a family to walk away in the middle of their lives? Over the years, countless people have stepped into this house, drawn by its mystery. Some describe the feeling of being watched, an unseen presence that lingers in every room. Others speak of a silence so heavy it makes your chest tighten. The walls seem to breathe with secrets. A clock on the dining room wall has long since stopped, but its hands remain frozen at a very specific hour, an hour that seems to hold meaning no one has been able to interpret. It is as if the house itself is locked at that moment, refusing to move forward, refusing to let go of what happened here. Imagine it, a meal prepared with care, laughter echoing only hours before, and then suddenly, nothing. The family vanishes. Their belongings remain, their food remains, their world remains, but they are gone. Neighbors passing by in the days after recall the curtains swaying gently, lights flickering faintly inside at night, though no one answered when they knocked. At first, some believed the family had simply left in haste, perhaps an emergency trip, perhaps some personal crisis. But days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, and still no one returned. The house stood silent, waiting, its dining table still set like a stage with actors who never came back to finish their roles. Authorities eventually entered, expecting to find answers, but instead they found something far more perplexing: nothing. No bodies, no sign of forced entry, no broken glass, no splintered doors. There was no chaos, no violence, only stillness. The beds upstairs were neatly made, clothes hung in wardrobes, children's shoes lined neatly near the door. And yet, not a trace of the family themselves remained. It was as if the earth had swallowed them whole while leaving behind everything they owned. Investigators walked out with more questions than answers, and over time, the case slipped quietly into obscurity. But the house never let anyone forget. Even now, decades later, the story of the abandoned meal lingers in local memory. Children dare each other to run up the porch steps and press their faces to the dust-streaked windows, whispering about ghosts caught between worlds. Elders shake their heads and warn against trespassing, saying some mysteries are not meant to be disturbed. Yet the house continues to pull at people like a magnet, its strange stillness daring them to look closer, to search for answers. To step into that dining room is to feel history pressing down on you, heavy and suffocating, as though you are intruding on a private tragedy. The air inside carries the faint scent of mildew, mixed with something sourer, older, that clings to the back of your throat. Dust motes drift lazily in the filtered light that sneaks through torn curtains. On the table, the plates seem almost too deliberate, too staged, yet no hand ever arranged them after that night. Every visitor describes the same unsettling detail, the sense that if you turned away for just a moment, the family might slip back into their seats, pick up their forks, and continue their meal as if nothing had happened. This is not simply an abandoned building. It is a question carved into wood and stone, a puzzle that has tormented imaginations for years. Why was dinner interrupted? Where did the family go? Why did they never return? With each passing year, the answers seem to drift further away, leaving only fragments of possibility. Some say the house is cursed. Some say the family fled from something unspeakable. Some whisper that they never left at all, that their shadows are still here, lingering in the corners, watching. But the truth, the real truth, remains locked somewhere inside these walls, waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to uncover it. And so, the house stands, silent yet screaming, filled with objects that make no sense without the people who once gave them meaning. A home abandoned in the middle of life, abandoned mid-meal, a time capsule of dread that refuses to let go of its mystery. As the dust settles on plates that will never again be touched, one thing becomes clear: whatever happened here was not ordinary. It was something far darker, and the story is only just beginning. The house did not just become a mystery on its own. Its silence spilled outward, touching the people who lived nearby, and over time, it became less a place and more a legend. In the early days after the disappearance, neighbors spoke about it in hushed voices, as though the very act of saying the family's name might invite misfortune into their own homes. Curtains were drawn tighter on the street, children were kept indoors after sunset, and the once friendly neighborhood grew heavy with suspicion and fear. Some families began locking their doors for the first time, worried not just about intruders but about something stranger, something they could not name. The children, of course, were the first to transform the house into a story. They gathered on sidewalks, pointing at its slanted roof and whispering about ghosts peering from the windows. Some swore they saw a pale figure standing in the upstairs hallway. Others claimed they heard laughter echoing faintly at night, laughter that never quite sounded human. For the young, it became a place of dares. Step onto the porch and touch the door, they would challenge each other. Press your face to the glass. Few lasted more than seconds before running away, hearts pounding with both terror and thrill. These childish games gave the house a reputation that quickly spread beyond the street, until it was whispered about across town. For the older residents, the house was no game. To them, it was a reminder of something deeply unsettling, that a family could vanish without trace, without warning, in the middle of ordinary life. Some recalled the father's stiff demeanor, the way he never lingered for small talk at the market. Others remembered the mother's soft smile, how she seemed tired more often than not, her hands clutching grocery bags as though weighed down by more than food. Everyone had a story about the family, and yet none of the stories explained why they had left their dinner behind and never returned. The more neighbors spoke, the less sense it all made. In the evenings, groups would gather on porches and speculate, their voices low and uncertain. Some suggested the family had been forced to flee, maybe debt collectors or dangerous acquaintances had come knocking. Others believed they had been taken, pulled into something larger and darker, though no one could quite define what that meant. Then there were those who insisted something unnatural had happened inside those walls, something beyond reason. They spoke of curses and restless spirits, of evil that fed on human souls. And though many dismissed such talk as superstition, they still avoided walking too close to the property at night. What unsettled people most was the house itself. Even as seasons changed, it did not crumble the way abandoned places usually do. Windows stayed intact. The roof sagged but never collapsed. The curtains, though faded, still hung in place. It was as though the house was being preserved by something unseen, kept in the same suspended state as the dinner table inside. Some nights, neighbors swore they saw a faint light flickering through the curtains, as if a candle burned in one of the rooms. They told themselves it must be trespassers, children sneaking in for thrills, but when police were called to investigate, the house was always empty. Older residents carried their memories like burdens. One woman recalled the sound of a baby crying on the night of the disappearance, though she later admitted she could not be sure it was real. Another man claimed he heard hurried footsteps in the gravel outside his window, footsteps that stopped suddenly, as if cut short. Each memory was a fragment, incomplete, impossible to verify. Over time, those fragments twisted into something else, folklore. Stories changed depending on who told them. In some versions, the family was murdered and their bodies hidden within the walls. In others, they had been cursed for sins long forgotten. And in nearly every retelling, the detail of the plates on the table remained, as though that frozen dinner had imprinted itself on the town's collective imagination. As years stretched into decades, the house's reputation only grew. Teenagers broke in on dares, their graffiti mixing with the untouched belongings of the family, creating a disturbing blend of past and present. They spoke afterward of feeling watched, of hearing whispers in the empty halls. Some described the sensation of walking into a room and realizing the air was colder there, heavier somehow. A few never spoke of what they saw inside, only shook their heads and refused to return. These stories, whether exaggerated or true, kept the legend alive. Yet beneath all the folklore, there remained the undeniable fact: this was not a ghost story invented for campfires. The family had been real. They had eaten that meal. They had lived in those rooms. Their disappearance was recorded in official police reports, their names etched in files that still gather dust in archives. This was not fiction, it was an event that left behind scars in the lives of neighbors who had known them. The old woman next door, who had once baked bread with the mother, never stopped leaving a candle in her window, whispering that she hoped the family might find their way home. A shopkeeper, who remembered the children saving coins for candy, kept their favorite sweets in stock long after they were gone, as though expecting them to return. Life went on, but small rituals of remembrance remained, quiet acknowledgments of a mystery unresolved. The house, however, did not allow time to soften its presence. Each year, it seemed to loom larger in memory, its silence pressing harder on the town. Outsiders came to see it, drawn by rumors, by the eerie detail of the abandoned meal. Journalists snapped photos of the table, the chairs, the dust-thick rooms, and left with more questions than they arrived with. Paranormal investigators brought their cameras and recorders, chasing shadows in the hallways, and though they captured little, they added fuel to the legend. The house fed on attention, its mystery deepening with every story told. For the community, it became impossible to separate fact from fiction. Was the family fleeing danger? Were they victims of violence that had been expertly concealed? Or had something stranger happened, something that defied explanation? The whispers never stopped, never died out. Even now, decades later, the people who live nearby still cross the street rather than walk past its gate. They say the silence of that house clings to you if you linger too long, and the image of those plates on the table follows you home. And while neighbors told stories, spun theories, and nurtured fears, one truth stood out above all others: this was not just rumor. This was not just imagination. The family had vanished, and the official records proved it. That was the most haunting part of all, that behind every whisper, every superstition, every frightened glance, there was a foundation of cold, undeniable fact. Every mystery begins with people. Before they became shadows in a story, before their house became a frozen monument, the family was just like any other, imperfect, complicated, alive. To understand the strangeness of their disappearance, one must first understand the lives they lived, the faces behind the plates left behind. The father was a man both respected and distrusted in equal measure. In town, he was known for his discipline, his stern way of speaking, his insistence on order. He managed a small business, nothing glamorous, but enough to keep the family comfortable. Customers described him as serious, sometimes cold, a man who counted every coin and expected others to do the same. Yet others remembered him differently. Neighbors spoke of evenings when he offered a helping hand, lending tools, carrying heavy bags, fixing a broken fence without being asked. It seemed the man lived two lives, one for the public, another for his home. At home, he ruled with the same strictness he brought to work. The children learned quickly not to test his patience. He was not cruel in the way that leaves marks on skin, but his voice carried weight that silenced rooms. The mother bore the brunt of his temper more quietly, her smile often shrinking when he entered the room. And yet, she stayed loyal, kept the house clean, cooked meals that warmed the kitchen with scents of herbs and bread. She was a gentle presence, but not without her own strength. To some, she seemed fragile, to others, she seemed to carry an invisible burden that no one dared to ask about. She had once been vibrant, full of life, with dreams that stretched beyond the limits of her small town. Old friends remembered her as a girl who loved to sing, whose laughter could fill a space. But by the time she had become a wife and mother, that laughter had grown softer, almost hidden. She spent more and more time inside, retreating into the rhythm of domestic life. Some neighbors said she seemed lonely, as if her world had shrunk to the four walls of the house and the routines that filled them. Yet she cared deeply for her children, and they adored her. Every story of her ends with an image of her hands, stirring soup, tying shoelaces, brushing hair from a child's forehead. The children themselves brought brightness into the house, even when shadows lingered around the edges. The eldest, a boy on the cusp of adolescence, was thoughtful beyond his years. Teachers described him as intelligent but distracted, as if his mind was always elsewhere. He loved books, devoured them by the handful, stories of adventure and faraway lands. Sometimes, he carried a notebook with him, scribbling down his own tales, fragments of dreams and half-formed ideas. His younger sister was his opposite, restless, curious, always laughing. She collected little things, shiny stones, marbles, ribbons, and kept them in a small box under her bed. She was the kind of child who made friends easily, who could run barefoot in the grass for hours without tiring. Together, the siblings balanced each other, the boy's seriousness softened by his sister's joy. The family was not wealthy, but they were not struggling either, at least not openly. Their home was modest but well kept, the kind of place built not for display but for living. And yet, if one looked closely, there were cracks beneath the surface. Some recalled whispers of money troubles, debts quietly accumulating behind the father's careful bookkeeping. Others spoke of arguments overheard through thin walls, voices raised late at night when they thought no one was listening. There were rumors, too, suggestions of infidelity, of secrets exchanged in dark corners of town. None of it was ever proven, but where there is smoke, people believe there must be fire. Despite the shadows, there were moments of light that stood out in memory. The family was last seen together in town, just hours before they vanished. Witnesses described a rare sight, laughter. The father, usually so stiff, was smiling, his arm draped over his wife's shoulder. The children chased each other around the table of a small cafe, giggling as they shared a slice of pie. It was the picture of normalcy, of warmth, of happiness. If anyone had known what was to come, perhaps they would have paid closer attention to the details, the look in the mother's eyes, distant even as she laughed, the father's smile that didn't quite reach his gaze, the boy's distracted frown between bites of food. But to those who watched them that day, they seemed like any family, carrying on with life as though nothing were wrong. Hours later, everything would change. The cafe closed, the family walked home, and the world continued as it always had. No one saw them again after that night. The children never returned to school. The mother never came back to the market. The father's business was left unattended. What had seemed so ordinary in those final moments became haunting in hindsight, the last chapter before the book closed forever. It is easy to forget that behind every mystery are people who once lived, laughed, argued, dreamed. The abandoned plates on the dining table belonged to a family with favorite meals, with bedtime stories, with arguments about chores. They were not characters in a legend, not yet. They were real, flesh and blood, with hopes for the future. The father dreamed of expanding his business. The mother longed for quiet moments of joy that seemed to slip away too often. The boy wanted to write stories of worlds far away. The girl wanted to grow up without ever losing her laughter. When the family vanished, it was not just an absence, it was the sudden erasure of all those dreams, all those ordinary moments. That is why their story haunts so deeply. They were not strangers to their community. They were part of its fabric, woven into daily life, into routines and memories. Their disappearance was not only a mystery but a wound, one that left everyone asking the same unanswerable question: how could life stop so abruptly, in the middle of something so ordinary? The legend of the abandoned meal endures because it was not just a meal. It was the interruption of life itself, cut short at a moment of togetherness. And when people remember that family, through stories, through rumors, through the photographs still left in the house, they do not remember ghosts or myths. They remember a father, a mother, a boy, and a girl who lived, who breathed, who vanished. And that memory is what makes their silence all the more unbearable. The night of the disappearance was not extraordinary at first glance. It began like countless evenings before it. The air carried the faint chill of a changing season, the kind that makes windows fog and sends neighbors inside earlier than usual. Lights glowed in living rooms across town as families gathered for dinner, voices and laughter rising behind closed doors. Nothing about that night seemed marked for tragedy. And yet, for one family, it would be their final meal, their last moment together before vanishing into silence. The kitchen smelled of roasted meat, of onions simmered in butter, of bread fresh from the oven. On the counter, herbs had been scattered, their stems left behind as though the cook had been too hurried or too tired to clean as she went. A pot bubbled faintly on the stove, the last of its steam still lingering in the air. It was a meal made with care, not lavish, but hearty and comforting, a reminder of stability in uncertain times. The mother, her apron dusted with flour, had moved between stove and table with the ease of habit, placing dishes with a practiced grace. The children sat eagerly, their voices filling the room with fragments of chatter. Neighbors later recalled hearing laughter from within the house, the faint clink of cutlery, the muffled sound of a radio playing some distant tune. It seemed a picture of ordinary life, of warmth contained within walls. No one outside could have guessed that within hours, the scene would transform into something chilling, something that would perplex investigators for decades. At the dining table, the father took his usual seat at the head, posture upright, voice carrying authority even in simple conversation. He spoke of business, of accounts and numbers, of tasks that weighed on his mind. The boy, half listening, pushed peas across his plate while sneaking glances at the notebook he kept near him. The girl leaned forward, eager to tell a story from her day, her words spilling out quickly, almost tripping over themselves in excitement. The mother smiled faintly, her eyes darting between her children, her husband, the food she hoped they would eat before it cooled. And then, something shifted. The exact moment has been lost to time, but evidence tells its own story. The meal was interrupted. Chairs pushed back, plates half finished, drinks left untouched. There was no sign of a conclusion, no stacked dishes, no cleared table, no goodbye. It was as if, in the middle of conversation, something called them away, something strong enough to draw the entire family from their seats without hesitation. When authorities first entered the house days later, they were struck by the eerie precision of the scene. Forks rested mid-bite, one tipped against the edge of a plate as though dropped suddenly. A knife glistened with the last trace of fat from the roast, its blade never wiped clean. A glass of milk had soured where it stood, its skin thickening under the film of dust. The bread, once warm, had hardened into stone. And above it all, a clock on the wall hung motionless, its hands frozen at a very specific time. No one could say for certain if the clock had stopped naturally, or if it had been deliberately set, but the implication haunted everyone who saw it. The living room bore no signs of struggle. The chairs were upright, the lamp still glowing faintly when police entered, its bulb buzzing with exhaustion. Upstairs, the beds were made, clothes folded neatly, toys tucked where they belonged. It was not a scene of panic. It was not a scene of violence. It was a scene of life interrupted, paused mid-breath. Detectives retraced every step. They imagined the family seated together, imagined the moment laughter turned to silence. Did they hear a knock at the door? A sudden noise outside? Did someone arrive, someone they trusted enough to rise from the table for? Or was it something else entirely, something that left no footprints, no fingerprints, no trace? Each theory only deepened the mystery. The neighbors who lived closest swore they noticed nothing unusual. No screams, no shouts, no signs of argument. One elderly man claimed he saw the front door ajar at dawn, though he admitted he might have been mistaken. Another insisted she heard the faint sound of crying that night, though she could not say if it came from the family's house or from her own dreams. None of it provided answers. Over the years, investigators tried to reconstruct that final supper with as much detail as possible. Experts studied the remains of food, determined what dishes had been served, how much had been eaten, how quickly the meal had been abandoned. Forensic teams analyzed the table, searching for fingerprints, for anything unusual, but found only the prints of the family themselves. No stranger's hand had touched the plates, no intruder had disturbed the setting. It was as if the family had risen from the table and vanished into thin air. What lingers most in memory is not the food, not the frozen clock, not even the eerie silence of the house. It is the sense of anticipation that hangs in the air, as though the family might return at any moment to finish what they began. Every visitor to the house describes it the same way, that the meal feels suspended, incomplete, waiting. The plates sit patiently, the chairs invite their owners back, the room feels alive with absence. And yet, the absence never ends. Days turn to weeks, weeks to years, and still no one returned to clear the table. The chairs remained empty, the plates untouched. What was once a dinner became an altar, a haunting tableau of unfinished life. Visitors whispered that to look at the table too long was to feel pulled into the family's fate, to feel the urge to leave suddenly, to flee into the night and never return. The scene became the heart of the legend, the detail repeated in every telling. It was not simply that a family vanished, it was that they vanished mid-meal, mid-laughter, mid-life. The abandoned supper became a symbol, the most ordinary of acts transformed into the most extraordinary of mysteries. It was the detail that captured imaginations, the detail that no one could explain, the detail that made the story unforgettable. For the investigators, it was also the detail that haunted them most. If a family could disappear from their dinner table, what did that mean for the rest of us? What does it mean when safety, routine, and the warmth of a shared meal can vanish in an instant, leaving only silence and dust behind? And so, the table remains, untouched, waiting. The food long decayed, the glasses clouded, the plates thick with grime. Yet in that stillness, the memory of that night lingers, refusing to fade. The last supper of a family who never came back. A mystery locked forever in the heart of an ordinary home, its silence louder than any explanation could ever be. The authorities did not rush at first. In small towns, disappearances often resolved themselves. Families traveled suddenly, left without notice, or became tangled in private matters they did not want to share. But days passed, then weeks, and the house remained silent. When concerned relatives finally insisted, the police unlocked the front door and stepped into the place where time had stopped. What they found was not the chaos of an abandoned home, not the wreckage of a crime scene, but something far more unsettling: normalcy turned to stone. The first officers to walk through the door later described the atmosphere as oppressive. Dust already clung to surfaces, yet everything else seemed untouched. Their flashlights moved across photographs, shelves of books, shoes lined neatly near the door. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested struggle. It was as if the family had stood up from the dinner table and simply dissolved into air. The table was the first thing that struck them. Plates still arranged, silverware resting where it had been dropped, food decayed but intact. A glass of water clouded with dust motes, a wine bottle half empty, the cork left beside it. For officers used to scenes of theft, of violence, of disorder, this was something different. The room looked staged, though they knew it was not. They moved carefully through each room. In the kitchen, pots remained on the stove, one lid tilted as though lifted moments before. In the living room, a radio hummed faintly with static, its plug still in the wall. Upstairs, the children's beds were neatly made, their toys waiting where small hands had last placed them. There were no signs of forced entry. Windows were locked from the inside. Doors were unbroken. Valuables remained in plain sight, jewelry, watches, even cash in a drawer, untouched. If someone had entered with the intent to rob or harm, they had left without disturbing a thing. Detectives joined the officers, their trained eyes scanning for what casual observation might miss. They noted small details that unsettled them further. A candle had burned halfway down in the parlor, its wax frozen mid-drip. A clock on the wall had stopped at an exact time, though no one could say whether it had broken that night or long before. In the bathroom, a towel still hung damp over a rack, as though someone had just stepped from the shower. It was not simply an abandoned home, it was a life interrupted in motion, caught in amber. Interviews began almost immediately. Neighbors were questioned, their memories scrutinized. Most admitted they noticed little unusual. Some claimed they heard laughter that night, faint but cheerful, followed by silence. One woman said she thought she heard footsteps outside after midnight, though she had convinced herself it was a dream. Another swore she saw a figure standing at an upstairs window days after the disappearance, though when police investigated, the house was empty. Stories contradicted each other. Memory shifted like sand. Nothing could be confirmed. The family's relatives were next. The father's brother described him as a man of principle, hard-working, disciplined. But when pressed, he admitted he was also proud, secretive, unwilling to share burdens even with family. A cousin recalled whispers of financial difficulty, though no records confirmed it. The mother's sister spoke of her as gentle, devoted to her children, but admitted she had seemed withdrawn in recent months. No one provided a motive for sudden flight. No one offered an explanation for why they would leave dinner unfinished. The investigators began cataloging evidence. Photographs were taken of every room, every angle of the dining table, every personal item left behind. Forensic teams dusted for fingerprints but found nothing out of place, the family's prints were there, no others. Soil samples were taken from the yard, looking for signs of struggle, but no disturbed earth suggested hasty burial. Even the dog's bowl in the kitchen corner was noted, water dried up, food untouched, suggesting the animal too had been abandoned abruptly. As the days wore on, detectives began to argue among themselves. Some believed the family had chosen to leave, that some hidden shame or private danger had driven them to vanish. But the theory frayed under scrutiny. Why would they leave valuables? Why not pack clothes? Why not take their children's favorite belongings? Others believed they had been taken, lured or forced by someone they trusted enough to open the door to. Yet no evidence of entry, no fingerprints, no footprints supported the idea. The ground outside showed no marks of tires, no signs of struggle in the dirt. It was as though the night had swallowed them cleanly. The lead detective grew obsessed. He walked the rooms again and again, lingering in silence, trying to imagine what had happened in those final moments. He pressed his hand against the dining table, as though the wood itself might yield an answer. He stood at the stopped clock, studying its frozen hands, wondering if it marked the hour of departure or simply mocked him with coincidence. He told colleagues that the case felt different, that the house was not simply a location but a presence, a character in its own right. Then came the discovery that deepened the mystery further. In the parents' bedroom, beneath loose floorboards, an officer found a small locked diary. The book was worn, its cover faded, its pages yellowing. It had been hidden deliberately, tucked where no casual search would uncover it. Inside, the handwriting belonged to the mother. Her words painted a picture very different from the surface of the family's life. The early entries were mundane, notes about groceries, chores, small joys of her children. But as the pages turned, a shift occurred. Her words grew anxious, paranoid. She wrote of a feeling of being watched, of shadows outside the window, of footsteps she could not trace. She hinted at money troubles, at debts she could not understand, at her husband's temper rising in ways that frightened her. What disturbed investigators most were the final entries. Her writing grew frantic, sentences unfinished, thoughts scattered. She mentioned voices in the night, dreams that left her waking in cold sweats, an overwhelming certainty that something was coming. Her last entry was brief, a single sentence written in shaky hand, "Tonight it ends." The diary cast the case into new territory. Was the mother predicting her family's disappearance? Had she known something others did not? Was she losing her grip on reality, or was she the only one who saw the truth? The investigators debated, their theories multiplying, but answers remained elusive. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with rumors. Word of the diary spread quickly, distorted with every retelling. Some said the mother had been possessed, others that she had joined a cult. Some whispered that the father had discovered her secret and silenced the family to protect his reputation. Each version of the story grew darker, more elaborate, feeding the legend of the house. But inside the police station, away from gossip, the files only grew heavier with unanswered questions. The house remained sealed, guarded for a time, then left alone when leads dried up. The plates remained on the table, the clock remained stopped, the diary remained locked away in evidence. The investigators could not solve the puzzle, and yet they could not let it go. One detective would later confess that the case never left him. He said the silence of that dining room followed him into his dreams. He said he sometimes woke in the night convinced he had heard the clink of a fork on porcelain, the faint sound of chairs scraping across wood. He said he came to believe that the truth lay not outside but within the house itself, buried in its walls, waiting. And in the end, perhaps he was right. Because the house would not rest, and its secrets were far from finished. The diary sat in evidence for weeks before anyone had the courage to study it properly. At first glance, it was an ordinary notebook, leather cracked with age, its corners frayed, the lock more decorative than functional. But within its fragile pages lay the only true voice the family had left behind, the voice of the mother, whispering across time in ink that had begun to fade. When investigators opened it, they found not answers, but a labyrinth of words that only deepened the mystery. The earliest entries painted a picture of a woman very different from the ghostly figure that townsfolk later conjured in their stories. She wrote of daily routines, the price of flour at the market, the way her daughter refused to eat vegetables, the pride she felt when her son brought home a drawing from school. These passages breathed with warmth, with humor, with an eye for detail that revealed her longing to hold on to the small joys of life. He left his shoes by the door again, she wrote of her husband in one early note. I nearly tripped, but I laughed. Some days I feel like I am the only one keeping this house from falling apart, yet it is mine to keep, and I do not mind. As weeks turned to months, subtle changes crept into her words. She began to note her husband's moods, his silences, his tempers, the way his eyes seemed to fix on nothing for long stretches. She wondered if business was troubling him, though he refused to share. He grows quieter, she wrote. Sometimes I feel there are conversations happening inside his head that I am not welcome to hear. She mentioned money, debts whispered but never explained, strange men at the shop who spoke to him in low tones. Her words circled around shadows she could not name, a gathering weight pressing on her home. Then came the unease. She wrote of waking in the night to sounds outside her window, footsteps crunching in the gravel, though when she looked, the yard was empty. She described a tapping on the glass, too faint to be the wind, too deliberate to be dismissed. When I turn on the lamp, she noted, there is nothing there. But I know someone was. Neighbors would later insist they heard nothing on those nights, but her diary insisted otherwise. The children, too, began to appear differently in her writing. The boy, once dreamy and bookish, grew restless. She wrote of him refusing to sleep, of him scribbling late into the night in his notebook, his eyes shadowed, his manner withdrawn. One entry noted him staring at the wall for so long she thought he might be listening to something she could not hear. The girl remained lively, but the mother wrote of her laughter ringing oddly in certain rooms, echoing in ways that unsettled her. She laughs, the mother wrote, but sometimes I do not know what she is laughing at. Her words turned darker as the months crept closer to that final night. She described whispers in the hallway, soft voices that ceased when she approached. She wrote of seeing her husband standing in the garden long after midnight, unmoving, staring into the trees. When she asked what he was doing, he only said he was thinking, though his eyes seemed distant, unfocused. It is as if he is waiting, she wrote. For what, he will not say. I no longer ask. There were mentions of arguments, her husband's anger flaring without reason, his voice sharp, his silences sharper still. She confessed her growing fear that the house itself was conspiring against her, that its walls listened, that its floors carried messages in their creaks. One particularly chilling entry read, "The clock stopped again tonight. It always stops at the same time. I wind it, I replace the battery, but by morning, its hands are frozen where they were before. It is not broken. It is marking something. I feel it." Investigators lingered on that passage, because when they entered the house, the clock had indeed been stopped at that exact hour. As the final weeks approached, the diary became more frantic. Her handwriting grew uneven, the words slanting, ink blotched as though written in haste. She wrote of dreams where faceless figures stood around the dining table, watching her family eat. She described waking to find her daughter sleepwalking, standing by the front door, hand on the knob as if about to leave. She wrote of her son whispering to someone in his room though no one was there. He says he hears a voice, she wrote. I told him it was his imagination, but when he looked at me, I knew he did not believe me. And worse, I am not sure I believe myself. Then came the entry that disturbed investigators most. A full page, scrawled in uneven lines, "There is something in this house. It does not want us here. Or perhaps it wants only us. I cannot tell. The air grows colder at night, and I feel it watching. The children are restless. He is restless. I do not know how much longer we can pretend that this is ordinary life. Tonight I heard a voice call my name, not from outside, not from within, but from the walls themselves. I do not know if I am losing my mind." The very last entry was dated the night of the disappearance. Her handwriting was jagged, rushed, barely legible. It contained only 3 words, "Tonight it ends." For detectives, the diary was both revelation and torment. Did it suggest a woman unraveling, succumbing to paranoia, seeing shadows where there were none? Or did it suggest she was the only one who understood the danger looming over her family? If she knew something was coming, why did she not run? Why prepare a meal, why set the table, why act as though the evening was ordinary? Unless, of course, she knew the meal was part of the end itself. The diary was kept from the public for years, sealed in evidence. Only fragments leaked into rumor, fueling ghost stories and speculation. Some believed the mother was warning of a human threat, debts or enemies her husband had concealed. Others believed she was describing something supernatural, a haunting that culminated in the family's disappearance. Still others wondered if she herself had orchestrated the end, her words a final confession before leading her family into silence. Yet the diary offered no clear answers, only questions layered upon questions. What was she afraid of? What did she mean by, "Tonight it ends"? And why, above all, did the family's final supper look so ordinary if she believed the night would bring catastrophe? The investigators who read her words found themselves changed. Some admitted they dreamed of the house afterward, dreamed of sitting at that table with plates before them, unable to move, unable to speak. Others confessed they felt the weight of her fear pressing on their own lives, as though reading her words had carried her dread into their bones. The diary was not a solution. It was a door, one that opened not onto clarity but onto deeper shadows. It made the family's disappearance feel less like a crime to be solved and more like a fate to be feared, a fate written in ink long before the plates were set, long before the laughter fell silent. And still, the final page waited, its 3 words etched like a curse. Tonight it ends. The diary should have brought clarity, but instead it opened a door that no one could close. Once its pages were examined, the case stopped being a disappearance and became something stranger, a riddle that demanded answers but punished anyone who tried to solve it. Theories began to multiply like weeds, each one tangled in fear, suspicion, and imagination. Some were rooted in logic, others in desperation, and some seemed born only from the hunger to explain what could not be explained. The most common theory was also the most human, that the father had been involved in something he could not escape. The whispers of debt that ran through the town grew louder after the diary surfaced. Men at his business had been seen visiting late, their voices low, their expressions sharp. Perhaps, some said, he owed money to the wrong people. Perhaps those people came to collect their due, and the family became collateral. But even as this story spread, it faltered. If the family had been taken as punishment, why leave the house untouched? Why not ransack it? Why not remove valuables? Why leave behind evidence of the meal? The order of the scene made no sense for a violent crime. Others took the theory further. Maybe the father himself had orchestrated the disappearance. Perhaps, under pressure, he led his family away, abandoning their home to escape danger. But if so, where did they go? No tickets, no witnesses, no sightings confirmed their departure. Their bank accounts were untouched, their belongings remained. If the father had fled with his family, he left without preparation, without even packing a bag. It was a possibility that raised more questions than it answered. Another theory turned suspicion toward the mother. Her diary, after all, was filled with fear, paranoia, and the sense of an ending. What if she was not merely recording her dread but creating it? Some suggested she had grown unstable, her mind unraveling under the weight of isolation and secrets. Perhaps she poisoned the meal, leading her family into death together, and then somehow their bodies were removed. Others imagined she led them into the night willingly, convinced by voices only she could hear. But again, no bodies, no traces, no sign of violence appeared. The diary could be read as a cry for help, or as a map into madness, but neither interpretation explained how an entire family could vanish without a mark. The darker corners of rumor gave birth to more sinister possibilities. There were whispers of cults in the surrounding areas, of gatherings in forests at night, of strange symbols etched into abandoned barns. Some claimed the father had been involved, drawn by promises of fortune or power. Others said the mother had been marked since childhood, her family bound by something older than memory. The stopped clock, the unfinished meal, the final diary entry, these became symbols in whispered theories of ritual, of sacrifice, of a covenant fulfilled. The house itself was said to be cursed, chosen as a place where endings could occur without witnesses. The supernatural explanations multiplied quickly. Neighbors spoke of lights in the sky that night, flashes too quick to be lightning, too silent to be fireworks. A farmer claimed he saw a column of mist rising from the family's yard, swirling unnaturally before vanishing into the air. Children dared each other to approach the house, swearing they heard voices calling from inside long after it was empty. Some said the family had been taken by something not human, drawn out of their seats at the table and swallowed whole by the unseen. Theories of abduction by forces beyond understanding, angels, demons, or something else, spread like fire through a community desperate for explanation. Skeptics argued for something simpler. Perhaps the family staged the scene themselves. Perhaps they set the table, left the food, and walked away to start over elsewhere. But skeptics had no answer for the details: the damp towel, the half-burned candle, the unfinished drinks. Why construct such a theatrical scene? Why vanish mid-meal, when any other departure would have been less conspicuous? If the family wanted to escape unnoticed, they had chosen the most bizarre way possible to leave. Investigators tried to organize the theories into categories: criminal, psychological, supernatural, but the categories collapsed into one another. The diary mentioned debts and shadows, but also voices in the walls. The evidence showed an ordinary home, but also an inexplicable stillness. Every path to reason led back to the same locked door. The most haunting theory was also the simplest, that the family never left the house at all. Some investigators returned to the property convinced the answer lay within the walls, in the ground beneath the floors, in hidden spaces no one had yet uncovered. They searched again and again, scanning for voids, for disturbed soil, for hidden rooms. But nothing revealed itself. The house stood silent, its secrets intact, its air heavy with unanswered questions. As years passed, the theories hardened into legend. Each retelling emphasized different details, reshaping the story to suit its teller. In one version, the father murdered his family and buried them in the woods. In another, the mother led them in a ritual that consumed them all. In yet another, they were taken by something that left no trace. The truth became less important than the story itself, and the story fed on mystery, growing stronger with every unanswered question. What gave the story its power was not just the disappearance but the ordinariness of the moment it interrupted. A family, a meal, laughter and silence. It could have been anyone's table, anyone's night. Theories multiplied because the truth seemed impossible, and in the absence of answers, imagination became the only tool left. Each theory reflected the fears of those who told it, fear of violence, fear of madness, fear of forces beyond control. Yet, through it all, the diary remained the core. Those fragile pages carried the weight of every theory, every suspicion. They were the only evidence of forewarning, the only clue that something was amiss before the meal was left unfinished. And in the end, every theory returned to those final words, "Tonight it ends." What ended that night, the family's life, their sanity, their freedom, or something larger, remained unknown. And perhaps that was why the story endured. Because no theory, no matter how convincing or absurd, could strip away the silence of that table, the weight of those empty chairs, the finality of food left to rot on plates that should have been cleared. For decades the case remained frozen, like the meal left on the table. Investigators grew old, theories faded into rumor, and the house itself stood as the only witness, silent and patient. And then, years later, a man returned, a man who claimed he had seen something that night but had never spoken. His name had once been known in the town, but time had carried him far away, and when he came back, it was as if the past itself had stepped into the present. He was older now, his hair thin, his hands trembling as he spoke. At first he hesitated, unsure if his memory mattered after so long, unsure if it would only paint him as another voice in the endless noise of speculation. But he insisted there was something he had never forgotten. He had been a young man then, restless, working late shifts at a nearby mill. He often walked home at night, cutting past the family's street when others were asleep. On the night of the disappearance, he said, he passed by their house just after midnight. The first thing he noticed was the light. The curtains were drawn, but a glow leaked through, flickering strangely, not steady like a lamp, not rhythmic like a television. It pulsed, he said, like fire hidden behind walls. He slowed his pace, curiosity mixing with unease. That was when he heard it, the sound of voices, raised but muffled, not laughter, not argument, but something that made the hairs on his arms rise. He could not make out words, only tones, sharp and low, overlapping in ways that did not sound like a family speaking to one another. He swore that as he approached the gate, he heard the daughter laugh, but it was not the light, carefree sound he remembered from seeing her play in the yard. It was distorted, stretched, echoing strangely as though the house itself had joined in. He froze, uncertain whether to continue, when the sound cut off abruptly, replaced by silence so sudden it felt forced. He stood there, staring at the drawn curtains, the flickering light still pulsing faintly, until a shadow moved across the window. Tall, too tall to be anyone in the family. The figure stopped, as if sensing him, and for a moment he felt its gaze pierce through the fabric of the curtain. Fear gripped him then, and he left quickly, walking fast, not daring to look back. By the time he reached his own home, he told himself it had been his imagination, a trick of exhaustion and night. He never reported it. He had no desire to be mocked, no wish to be entangled in gossip or suspicion. And when the family was discovered missing days later, he kept his silence, convincing himself that what he had seen could not possibly matter. But in the quiet years that followed, the memory grew heavier, until it pressed on him like the very air he breathed. Now, decades later, he spoke. Investigators who had retired were summoned back, journalists descended, and the town once again leaned in to listen. His account reignited old debates, sharpened old fears. Some believed him immediately, seeing in his story confirmation of supernatural theories, the flickering light, the unnatural voices, the tall shadow that did not belong. Others dismissed him, arguing that memory after so many years could not be trusted, that he had absorbed the town's legends into his own recollection, reshaping what he saw into something more dramatic. Yet there was something about the way he spoke, the way his voice faltered when describing the shadow, that convinced some he was telling the truth as he remembered it. His details were small but consistent, the smell of damp earth in the air, the sound of the clock from his pocket striking 12, the way the silence afterward seemed louder than any noise could be. He did not claim certainty. He only said, "I know what I saw, and I wish I had spoken then." His testimony complicated the story further. If he had seen a stranger's shadow in the house, how had that person entered with no sign of forced entry? If he had heard voices overlapping, what kind of conversation was taking place? Was it an argument with outsiders? A ritual? A gathering the family had willingly joined? And if so, why did no one else hear? Skeptics suggested he had seen a trick of the light, a tree branch swaying in front of the window, his tired mind inventing voices where there were none. They pointed to the unreliability of memory, how decades of silence could turn a fleeting impression into a story dressed in detail. But believers argued the opposite, that only someone who had truly seen could recall such haunting fragments that matched too closely with the diary's final pages. The flickering light, the voices, the sense of something unnatural pressing against the walls, all of it echoed what the mother had written before her hand fell silent. The man himself refused to argue. He told his story, then fell quiet, as though relieved to finally release it into the world. When asked why he had waited so long, he answered simply, "Because I was afraid. And because I thought, if I pretended I had seen nothing, it would not follow me." But it did. It always did. After his account spread, the house drew attention once more. Paranormal investigators arrived, eager to confirm what he described. They brought equipment, cameras, recorders, and swore they captured flickers of light no wires could explain, voices that whispered just beyond hearing. Skeptics countered with talk of faulty equipment, of imagination primed by expectation. But for the townspeople, the return of the witness sealed the house's reputation not just as a mystery, but as a place marked. The man lived only a few years after telling his story. He died quietly, without fanfare, but those who knew him said he looked lighter in his final days, as though he had carried a burden that had finally been set down. Whether his words were truth, invention, or something in between, they became part of the legend, woven inseparably into the fabric of a story already thick with shadows. And so, even decades later, the case remained unsolved. But now it carried a new image, a lone figure standing outside a house at midnight, watching flickering light through drawn curtains, hearing voices that should not have been there, and seeing a shadow too tall to belong. An image that suggested the family's disappearance was not merely an absence, but the presence of something else. Something that still lingered. He had been there from the very beginning, one of the first investigators to walk across the threshold of the silent house. In the photographs taken during those initial searches, you can see him in the background, tall, broad-shouldered, his gaze fixed not on the camera but on the details no one else seemed to notice. To most, he was just another detective doing his duty, but those who worked with him said the case lodged itself in his mind in a way they had never seen before. Long after reports were filed and evidence sealed, he lingered. Where others accepted the limits of what could be known, he refused to let the silence stand. At first, his obsession looked like dedication. He reviewed photographs, reread the mother's diary, re-interviewed neighbors. He walked the rooms again and again, sometimes alone, long after the house was cleared of evidence tape. He told colleagues he felt the house was wrong, though when pressed, he struggled to explain. He spoke of the stillness in the air, the way dust seemed to settle too quickly, the uncanny sensation of being watched even when alone. Others laughed it off as nerves, as imagination, but he did not laugh. He insisted that the case was not finished, that the truth remained within those walls. Over the years, as new cases filled the desks of his colleagues, he clung to the old files. He mapped timelines, tracked rumors, and followed faint trails of speculation across counties and states. Each lead ended in dead ends, but he returned to them again, certain he had overlooked something. The more time passed, the more he withdrew from other work, until his colleagues whispered that he had lost perspective. He retired earlier than expected, but retirement only freed him to devote himself entirely to the mystery. Locals would see him sometimes, standing outside the house, staring up at its windows as if waiting for them to open. At night, he would walk its perimeter with a flashlight, pausing at corners, pressing his hand against the walls as though feeling for a heartbeat. He carried the diary's copies in his pocket, rereading them so often he could recite whole passages from memory. He told friends that the key was there, in her words, but that he had not yet found the right way to read them. In his journals, discovered later, he wrote of patterns. He claimed the stopped clock was not coincidence, but a marker. He noted dates when neighbors heard strange noises, aligning them with lunar cycles, with anniversaries, with obscure references in the mother's diary. He traced symbols he believed he saw hidden in the family's belongings, marks on the floorboards, scratches near the window frames. To him, it was all connected, though to others it looked like madness, lines of string stretched between photographs, notes scribbled in margins until pages were black with ink. Then, one day, he vanished. It was not dramatic at first. He lived alone, kept to himself, so when he failed to appear in town for a few days, no one noticed. When a week passed, neighbors grew concerned. Police entered his home and found it in disarray, papers scattered, walls lined with notes and sketches of the house he had studied for decades. His table was covered with photographs of the family, copies of reports, the mother's words written over and over in his hand. But of the man himself, there was no trace. His bed was unslept in, his car parked outside. It was as if he had walked out the door and dissolved into air. Whispers began immediately. Some said he had gone mad and wandered into the woods, never to return. Others believed he had staged his disappearance, slipping away in pursuit of some final lead he had discovered. But those who had listened to him in his final months suspected something darker. He had told more than one confidant that the house wanted something, that it was not finished with him. He spoke of dreams where he sat at the family's dining table, unable to move, hearing footsteps behind him but unable to turn his head. He claimed he had begun to hear whispers even outside the house, faint voices in his own home, calling him back. When investigators searched his journals more carefully, they found a final note tucked inside the back cover. It was not signed, but the handwriting was his. It contained only a single line: "If I go missing, start at the table." That message ignited speculation that consumed the case once more. Some believed he had uncovered something hidden in the dining room, some truth that pulled him into the same fate as the family. Others dismissed it as the final scribble of a man whose obsession had broken his mind. Yet the note remained, haunting in its simplicity, pointing back to the scene where it had all begun. To this day, no trace of him has been found. No body, no belongings, no explanation. His disappearance was added to the files of the case he had devoted his life to, a cruel symmetry that made the story all the more chilling. The man who had searched for answers had become part of the very mystery he sought to solve. For the townspeople, his vanishing sealed the legend of the house as cursed. It was no longer only the family that had been taken, but the investigator who dared to chase them. Some swore the house would continue to claim those who pried too deeply, pulling them into the silence that already lived within its walls. Others warned children to stay away, saying that even standing at the gate too long could draw the attention of whatever lingered inside. But for those who knew him personally, the story was more tragic than supernatural. They remembered a man who could not let go, who carried the weight of an unsolvable case until it crushed him. Whether he walked into the woods, or into the arms of something unseen, they could not say. All they knew was that he had given his life to a mystery, and in the end, the mystery had claimed him entirely. And so the legend grew, not only of a family that vanished mid-meal, but of the detective who followed them into the void. His empty home became another echo, another silence, another question without an answer. And at the center of it all remained the same image, a table set for supper, plates unfinished, chairs waiting, as though the meal, and the mystery, had only just begun. It was nearly 40 years after the family vanished when the house was disturbed again. For years it had stood empty, boarded at times, broken into at others, its windows blind, its walls sagging under weather and silence. Children dared each other to run across its porch, thrill-seekers sneaked inside to take photographs, leaving behind graffiti and empty bottles. But the bones of the house remained untouched, until a new owner, determined to restore the property, began renovations. Workers were hired, their boots echoing on floors where investigators once crept. The new owner wanted to scrub away the dust of decades, to strip the house of its legend and make it livable again. But almost immediately, strange things surfaced. In the kitchen, behind plaster that crumbled under the workers' tools, something unexpected was found, a sealed compartment, hidden within the wall, its wooden panel covered over long ago. Inside, wrapped in fabric yellowed with age, lay a small collection of items no one could explain. There were photographs first, black and white, curled at the edges, of the family in candid moments. The father standing stiff in front of the shop. The mother with her children in the yard. But among them were other images, ones no one recognized. A blurred figure at the edge of the yard, tall and faceless, appearing again and again, always distant, always watching. Some swore it was only a flaw in the film, a shadow, a trick of light. Others whispered it was the same figure the late witness had described decades earlier. Alongside the photographs was a tape recorder, battered, coated in dust, but still intact. Investigators who were called to the scene managed to coax it back to life. What it played was faint, distorted by time, but unmistakable, the sound of voices. A family eating, clinking cutlery, the scrape of chairs, laughter that rose and fell. And then, without warning, the voices shifted. They grew low, overlapping, words indistinct, tones unnatural. The recording ended abruptly in static, as though cut short. The final item was a notebook, not the mother's diary, but another, smaller, filled with short phrases in shaky handwriting. At first glance it looked like nonsense, lines repeated, words incomplete. But as investigators studied it, they found patterns. The same sentence scrawled over and over, "We must not leave the table." The discovery reignited everything. News spread quickly, pulling journalists and investigators back into the orbit of the house. Theories multiplied once more, each detail feeding a different narrative. To some, the photographs proved that someone had been watching the family for months, perhaps years, stalking them before the disappearance. To others, the blurred figure was something less human, a presence caught on film that had no business being there. The tape recording split opinion even further. Skeptics argued it was staged, a prank left behind by trespassers years ago. But experts who studied it claimed the tape was too old to be a recent fabrication. And the voices, though faint, matched samples taken from home movies of the family. If genuine, then the tape was a recording of their final meal, preserved in a hidden compartment, as though someone wanted it to be found. But who? And why? The notebook unsettled even the hardened. The phrase, "We must not leave the table," was repeated dozens of times, sometimes legible, sometimes scrawled in frantic loops that tore the paper. Handwriting analysts could not agree on who had written it. Some said it resembled the father's hand, others saw traces of the son's immature script. If the family had written it, why? Was it a rule imposed on them, or a mantra of their own? The word seemed both warning and command, both plea and curse. The new owner, unnerved, abandoned the renovation. He left the house locked, refusing to step inside again. The evidence was taken, studied, catalogued, but it answered nothing. Instead it deepened the riddle, proving only that the house still had secrets to give, and that every answer contained a darker question. Even among officials, debates turned heated. Some believed the items had been planted decades ago by someone seeking to fuel the legend, perhaps even the obsessed detective who later vanished. Others were convinced the family themselves had hidden the compartment, leaving behind evidence no one was meant to find until years later. The photographs, the tape, the notebook, each piece hinted at knowledge, at preparation, at a family aware of something approaching. But if they knew, why stay? Why set the table, why eat, why wait for what they believed was coming? Theories once again reached beyond reason. Cult ritual, mass delusion, supernatural abduction, the discovery fueled them all. The phrase from the notebook spread like a refrain, painted on walls, whispered in documentaries, repeated online, "We must not leave the table." It became the case's new curse, echoing across decades, tethering the mystery to every retelling. For investigators, the worst part was the sound on the tape, the moment when laughter gave way to something else, something inhuman. They played it again and again, searching for clarity, for words hidden in the static. But the more they listened, the more it seemed to change, as though the recording itself resisted being understood. Some swore they heard their own name whispered faintly. Others refused to listen at all, claiming the tape carried something more than sound. And so, even with new evidence in hand, the story remained the same, an unfinished meal, a vanished family, and a house that would not release its hold on those who entered. The discovery did not solve the case. It only reminded everyone that time could not bury it, that silence could not smother it, that even decades later, the house still found ways to speak. The unearthed evidence did not bring closure. It brought a chill that spread outward once more, reminding the world that the story was not done, that somewhere within those walls, between photographs, voices, and words scrawled in panic, the truth waited still, unseen, unfinished, unresolved. The house still stands. Its paint has peeled, its windows sag, its roof bows under years of neglect, but it endures. It does not crumble, it does not collapse, as though held upright by the weight of the story woven into its walls. To passers-by it looks abandoned, another relic waiting for demolition. But those who know the story never see just wood and stone. They see the empty table, the vanished family, the shadows that returned even decades later. People say time heals all mysteries, that the years dull the edges of even the darkest puzzles. But this one has not softened. Instead, it has sharpened, each new detail cutting deeper, each theory pulling the story further into the realm of legend. The family's names are no longer just names. They are archetypes, the father with secrets, the mother with her diary of dread, the children frozen in youth. Their absence has become their legacy. Every decade seems to breathe new life into the case. A rumor, a sighting, a discovery hidden in the house's bones. And each time the world looks back, the story shifts slightly, never losing its core but always evolving. It is a mirror that reflects the fears of whoever peers into it. To some, it is a tale of crime and punishment, debts unpaid and collected in blood. To others, it is madness, the slow unraveling of a family's mind. And to many, it is something darker, proof that the world holds doors that should never be opened, and that once opened, they do not close. What haunts most is not what is known, but what remains unseen. The plates on the table, half finished, are not violent in themselves. They are ordinary. It is their ordinariness that chills, the way life was interrupted mid-breath, mid-bite, mid-laughter. The house did not show signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no forced entry. The family did not leave a note, did not take their belongings. They simply ceased to be, and in their absence they left only questions that spread like cracks in glass. The detective who vanished became part of that glass, another fracture radiating outward. His disappearance echoed the family's, and though no one could say the two were connected, the symmetry was too precise to ignore. And the unearthed evidence, the photographs of a faceless figure, the recording of laughter dissolving into something else, the notebook repeating its plea, was like fuel poured onto a fire that had never gone out. Together, they created a story too tangled to unravel, too incomplete to satisfy. And so the legend endures. Travelers visit the house, taking pictures from the street, some daring enough to step onto the porch, fewer still brave enough to cross the threshold. Those who do often report strange sensations, the air colder than it should be, the silence heavy, the smell of something faintly metallic, like blood or rust. Some swear they hear footsteps upstairs when no one is there. Others claim they hear chairs scraping faintly in the dining room, as though unseen figures rise from the table only to sit again. But the house never gives more than fragments, and fragments never make a whole. It withholds. It tempts. It invites obsession, then punishes it. Those who stare too long at the puzzle become part of it, swallowed into the story like the family, like the detective. Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the truth is not meant to be found, but to be pursued endlessly, so the house may continue to claim minds, if not bodies. The question that lingers is not simply what happened, but why it matters. Why this family, why this house, why this meal left unfinished? Why does the story still grip hearts and minds decades later, when so many other tragedies have been forgotten? The answer may lie in the ordinariness of it. This was not a royal palace or a battlefield. It was not a grand stage or a dramatic setting. It was a home, modest and familiar, its dining table like any other. The horror lies in the recognition, it could have been anyone's family, anyone's home, anyone's supper. And perhaps that is why the case resists closure. To solve it would be to confine it, to shrink it into one explanation, one theory. But to leave it unsolved is to leave it vast, to let it sprawl into the imagination of every listener, every generation. It has become more than a crime, more than a mystery. It is a story, and stories live longer when they are incomplete. In the end, the house remains. It stands against time, its silence louder than any evidence, its walls heavier than any file. And if you walk by at night, some say you can still see a faint glow behind the curtains, flickering not like a lamp, not like a television, but like fire hidden behind walls. Some say you can hear voices, not words, just tones, low and overlapping. And some say if you are foolish enough to step inside and sit at the table, you will feel a presence gather around you, unseen but undeniable, waiting for you to take a bite, waiting for you to stay. The truth of what happened may never be known. But perhaps that is the truth, that some mysteries do not close, some doors do not shut, some meals are never finished. And somewhere, in a house that refuses to die, a table still waits, its plates untouched, its silence eternal.